If you've played video games as long as I have, then you'll probably have your fair share of games that absolutely wrecked you. Whether it's a boss battle so tough that you wanted to put your controller through the screen, or a puzzle so obtuse that you had no choice but to throw your hands up in defeat and consult an online guide, or a tricky skill-based section that had you tearing your hair out because you just couldn't make that final jump in time. We've all been there because it's all part and parcel of completing games. You're not always going to overcome every obstacle first time or know exactly where you need to go next, because if you did, then the game wouldn't present a challenge and there would be no point in playing it. And when you do finally struggle through to the end, bloodied and tired but triumphant, it's a pretty good feeling because you've done something that was actually pretty difficult. You persevered and kept plugging away even when it seemed impossible, and you've ultimately become a winner. Or you can just play a modern mainstream game that'll do basically everything in its power to remove every possible source of frustration or confusion, to the point where the experience is more like watching a movie with occasional button presses to trigger the next cutscene. And the overall experience is about as satisfying as trying to have a deep and meaningful conversation with a stripper. It's become kind of a cliche in recent years that modern games are becoming easy to the point of parody, whether it's old favourites like the dreaded yellow paint telling you which direction to head next, or which ledges you can climb and which jumps you can make, to mini-maps where your next objective is highlighted and even the most efficient path has been programmed in, to in-game prompts and exasperated dialogue from your own character if you get stumped on a puzzle for more than 30 seconds, to patronising suggestions that you switch to retarded toddler mode if you get killed more than a few times on a boss battle. All of these different annoyances stem from the same basic problem. So many games today just won't leave you alone to play the fucking thing. They constantly feel the need to hold your hand, keep you on the correct track, reward you for the simplest actions, and push you forward to the next big dopamine hits. It's like being put in the world's most awesome play park as a kid, but you've got some neurotic, overprotective parent hovering around you at all times, ready to jump in if you even think about doing something vaguely dangerous. It sucks all the fun out of the experience because you feel like you never have the freedom to explore the world on your own terms. You're always being forced down the path that other people want you to walk. Now, don't get me wrong here, I understand that world traversal and environmental interaction in games is always a balancing act between exploratory freedom and player convenience, and the larger and more complex your game world becomes, the more you have to compromise the former to maintain the latter. Simply dumping someone into a game world the size of Witcher 3, for example, with no indication of where they should go or what they should do next is a pretty challenging prospect for any player. But that doesn't mean you have to constantly intrude on their gaming experience and actively push them towards the next waypoint, because once you insert that kind of persistent low-level navigation aid into the game, it starts to do weird things to you psychologically. Like, it becomes this persistent task that you feel you have to attend to, like you shouldn't dwell too long in any particular place because the game expects you to move along to the next story event. It's kind of like how drivers are slowly losing the ability to navigate with maps and road signs and generally think for themselves, because why bother when you've got a convenient little screen that'll tell you exactly where to head next, and it'll even find a new route if you have a brain fart and take a wrong turn. If the system is basically foolproof, then well, it kind of encourages people to become fools in return. It's the same thing when it comes to jumping and climbing around, where most games seem to lock your character into a couple of predefined paths like a train on rails, and not only will they refuse to let you deviate from them, but they'll even prevent you from trying jumps that you can't make. The early Tomb Raider games, for example, often demanded precision jumps and fast reflexes to make progress, and if you fucked up either of those things, then guess what? It was game over. But the upside to all of that is that there was often multiple ways to get through a level, and how you chose to do it depended on your own instincts and gaming style. Sometimes with enough experimentation, you could even unlock secret routes and hidden areas that even the developers hadn't thought of. But the remake series, on the other hand, locks you onto set paths for the bulk of your climbing, won't let you jump beyond your reach, allows Lara to stick to walls like a fucking magnet, and generally puts so many safeguards in your way that it's almost impossible to get killed by environmental hazards. And if there's no skill involved in that kind of world traversal, and it's basically just a linear series of button presses, then really, what's the point in even doing it? There was a similar problem with the Resident Evil series that used to give players a decent sized gaming world to explore, with multiple routes to get from one side of the map to another that always had to be balanced against enemy placement and resource availability, and just kind of let you do whatever you wanted. You had to investigate every room, explore thoroughly, try different ideas and see what might work. Now you're route ahead is so obviously spelled out, your objective is marked so clearly on the map, and every box and objects that you should be looking at is so clearly marked that there's no real sense that you're exploring or finding anything anymore. You're really just going around collecting the things that the game wants you to pick up, and seeing the things the game wants you to see without feeling like you're achieving a whole lot by yourself. My point here is that environmental navigation, like every other aspect of gaming from the puzzles up to the final boss, should offer a reasonable level of challenge and exploratory freedom for the player, giving them the ability to experiment with different strategies while providing just enough clues and hints to keep them heading in roughly the right direction. It means having enough faith in them to take the training wheels off and actually let them play and make mistakes for themselves, and this is where I think modern gaming seems to be going wrong. And it seems to be born out of this flawed belief that if players are left to their own devices for too long, they'll get bored and frustrated and move on to something else. It's actually not that different from a lot of mainstream movies when I think about it. The need to constantly keep the audience engaged with the next bit of CGI spectacle, the next action scene, the next member berry, instead of giving them slightly more challenging but less action-packed material to chew on. It underestimates the resilience of the average player and their ability to stick with a game that they're invested in, even if it throws a few frustrations their way. And I think this is where the real problem stems from. Modern game devs aren't sure of their ability to hook players with a gripping storyline, compelling characters, or rewarding gameplay because they're losing the ability to craft those things for other reasons. So instead, they're forced to rely on a steady stream of low-level rewards, superficial graphical spectacle, and constant progression with near zero obstacles to keep them from getting bored. Partly I think this problem's come about because the definition of what a gamer is has become so broad in recent years that it's practically meaningless now, usually so that companies like Sweet Baby can claim that 50% of them are female by including teenage girls who mindlessly swipe away at Candy Crush on their phones once a week. And well, if you want to attract a hypothetical audience who don't actually like traditional games, then I guess you need to make them easier and more accessible for everyone. But mostly I think it comes down to a lack of confidence, not just in their audience but more importantly in their own product, and it's proof that even movie scale budgets, incredible visuals and dev teams numbering the hundreds are no substitute for a good rewarding story and interesting characters. Most of my favourite games of all time look laughable by today's graphical standards, but it doesn't matter to me because quality gameplay and storytelling is more than enough to make up for any visual shortcomings. And yeah, I know that you've always got games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring if you're really in the mood for a challenge, but let's be honest here, those games are designed for a very specific audience. I know I'm generalising a bit, but I think the average gamer probably doesn't have enough time and energy to grind their way through games like that, where your average boss can take dozens if not hundreds of attempts to beat. And believe me, I'm not exempt from that either. I bought Elden Ring off the back of all the hype and put a good 20 or 30 hours into it before deciding, yeah, this game's not really for me. Not that I disliked it or anything, but after eventually defeating the first several bosses, I knew that getting good enough to beat the whole game was going to take more time than I had, and the process would probably be more frustrating than enjoyable. And for me, life's just too short for that kind of shit. So I guess what I'm saying with all my pish is that I think a lot of people are probably in a similar boat to me, good enough to find the hand-holding and constant assistance of mainstream games patronising and unnecessary, but not really willing to plough hundreds of hours into hardcore punishment sessions either. I guess a reasonable middle ground of challenging difficulty, exploratory freedom, and just being left alone to play the fucking game is what most average people are looking for, and it seems to be something that mainstream games are lacking these days. I just hope they learn from their mistakes. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.